Today we dive deep into the history of North and South America. From the first people to arrive on these lands and their evolution into different groups, to the impact of colonization by the Spanish and English, and the formation of the 13 states that signed the Declaration of Independence. We explore the major events and circumstances that led to the War of Independence, and the role Black people played during this period, as well as the consequences of the United States expansion after gaining independence. We also look into the main reason for the Civil War, the events that led to the Great Depression, and the key factors that contributed to the growth and development of the U.S. as a world power. Join us on this journey through the history of America. U.S. history does not begin with Columbus. It begins with the Bering Strait. Long ago, about 20,000 years ago, it was not a strait but a landmass, and people from Chukotka came through it, first to North America and then to South America. The so-called Paleo-Indians, about 5,000 years later, split into the southern and northern groups. Well, and then the strait again became the strait, and in the future, the guys evolved separately, following the standard scheme for mankind, dividing into tribes with the constant wars, which inevitably connected the tribes with one another, and proto-states appeared. We talked about the Maya people in one of the videos, but there were other guys you undoubtedly know. It is a mistake to think that America was so backward before the Europeans came. Look at the architecture of the Maya and you realize that the science was on a high level, though lagging behind Europe, and that predetermined the future of the continent. But it wasn't Columbus who first officially discovered America. It was the Viking Leif Erikson who discovered it somewhere in the 1000th year, that is about 5 centuries earlier. And in general, in Alaska, there were found iron artifacts of the same era, but came from Asia, except that these contacts did not bring special changes in the way of life of Indians. It began with the Columbus. Although, again, beads from Venice somehow appeared in America 50 years before him. But one way or another, in 1492, the fate of the entire planet was sealed. As we mentioned in the video about the Pilgrims and the first settlers, Columbus noted in his diary how good-natured and militarily weak the Indians were, and how great it would be to make money on them. And so it began. And it is a mistake to think that England started it. It can be noted except for the expedition of John Cabot in 1498. And even that guy rather explored Canada, while most of America was discovered and populated by the Spaniards. The conquistadors discovered Florida in 1513 and founded the first European colony there in 1565. It was the Spaniards who explored the Mississippi, Colorado, Missouri, and a number of other key areas of what is now the U.S. in the 16th century. The old, good way of gunpowder and blood, but it is worth noting that we are talking only about the first stages. Unlike the English, the Spaniards, for the most part, tried to assimilate the Indians and maintained good relations with them, even though they ruthlessly forced them to convert to Christianity. So by the time the English got to the creation of the first colony, the Spaniards had already taken over the whole of South America and were living happily ever after. The truth colonization of continent in opinion of many historians and has exhausted Spain. Invincible naval armada, which suffered a crushing defeat in the Anglo-Spanish War. And from 1588, the position of the boys in America was shaken, and the English in turn gained momentum. All this history we have described in detail in the video that we will upload next Sunday about the Pilgrim colonists, which we highly recommend you watch. But in short, the new continent attracted people with its freedom of manners and lack of pressure from the church and police, and the resources immediately found a lot, and the same English Jamestown lived happily, selling tobacco. Again, do not romanticize the first settlers. The contingent fleeing Europe, by definition, could not be white and fluffy. There were enough daredevils and criminals and heretics among the settlers, but the beginnings of capitalism did their work, and whole companies began to form in England to help people start new lives in America, but the government, for the most part, didn't care. The colonies seemed to them an image toy and nothing more. Often the colonists were given contracts under which they would earn back the money spent on them with goods from America. And just as often the colonists laid on these agreements with, well, you know what. Although at first there wasn't enough people in the English colonies, somewhere in the middle of the 17th century, there was a real boom, which went far beyond the country. For France was actively picking up Canada, creating its Louisiana, stretching from Quebec to New Orleans. The city of Detroit, by the way, was also founded by them, and in general, the French cooperated with the Indians in a more humane way, and often received their military support. That is why the territories of the country in America have grown so much. But the British influenced the history of the USA, and by the 18th century, those 13 states which later would sign the Declaration of Independence were formed. We will not immerse you in murky dates and showdowns. It is better to outline the situation briefly. And it was such that in time the British Crown saw the growing industry and commerce of a colony whose inhabitants considered themselves British citizens only in part. And by the time the colonies began to make real money, trade with Asia, build ships on their own, and enter into various treaties, Britain got hot and began a game of give and take, with the Crown trying to ban the colonies from everything and take over the government. And the colonists, in turn, dodged it time after time because it was almost impossible to control them due to the distance. In the meantime, the British states fought with the French with varying success. Everything was changed by the 7-Year War, which many historians consider to be the First World War. All Europe took part in it, and military actions were conducted even in North America. Lasted from 1756 to 1763, the war became decisive for the USA. For on the one hand, Englishmen in America have badly pressed French, and on the other hand, they were finally offended with Britain, which used all resources of the colony, repulsing with their help their own expenses. This led to the Civil War in 1775, but before we talk about it, let's mention another point. To think that the colonists were a single organization is mistaken. Delaware had Swedes, the Carolinas had French, you could find Germans in Virginia, as well as in Pennsylvania, and all this goodness treated itself as radically opposite religions. Chances are the guys would never have united if it weren't for two things. The first is the Pilgrim Fathers Declaration, which has been called the First Constitution. Remember the Mayflower Compact that the colonist members of the Mayflower ship signed? That's the one we're talking about. Well, the second was Britain, which mercilessly strangled the colonies, wanting to choose with whom to trade and with whom not to trade, and how much tax to pay. It was the British were the catalyst to unite the disparate American cities, which in 1774 gathered Congress. And they realized that they couldn't go on. After all, Benjamin Franklin 20 years ago tried to create a union of states, headed by a president appointed by Britain. The Crown's response was a stiff rejection, and the boys were left with nothing but an ultimatum. The First Continental Congress included representatives from 12 states, including George Washington. He gave Britain an ultimatum about the colony's desire for self-government, life, liberty, and property. The British responded with the traditional port blockade and show of force, and in 6 months, the predictable War of Independence broke out. For the colonists realized that no matter how different they were, they had better unite in the face of the threat. It is important to understand that at that time, it was far from the current United States. There was no smell of Texas, Florida, or the South. The Spaniards were still living there, even though their power was shaken, and France had huge holdings. A measly 13 states, with a tacit center in Boston, where revolutionary ideas burned especially brightly, had declared independence. Not everyone supported the war, of course, but in every state the number of British supporters was not dominant. The nation split into so-called patriots and loyalists. Of course, the people who were loyal to the crown were those who had a good life under it, but on the other hand, the revolutionaries and supporters of independence were mostly industrialists and small businesses. Black people also played a huge role. The first shipload of slaves from Africa to North America was brought by the Dutch in the 1620s, and since then, they have been extremely marketable goods on the plantations, and also a significant part of the population that both camps tried to win over to their side. Chaos ensued, in which often the slave-owning revolutionaries poached slaves from the loyalists, promising them freedom, while on the other side the same thing was happening. And on the third, the Africans, taking advantage of the chaos, were themselves rebelling. But the key was the decision by the states of Vermont and Massachusetts, which opposed Britain, to legislate the abolition of slavery in one form or another. The war itself is a story for a separate video, but in short, the ideas of the revolutionaries were more humane, rational, and logical, no matter how you look at it. The majority of the population by that time had not seen the metropolis in the eyes and be under the control of the misunderstood England did not want. So, at the end of 8 long years, the USA won, and in 1783 they got independence. To be more exact, it was ratified by the Peace Treaty, and the free states proclaimed their independence in 1776. Hence, modern Americans consider the birth date of the state. Well, in reality, it began to work at the end of the War for Independence, and this period goes down in history as Confederate. In brief, from 1781 to 1789, The Union States were kind of united in the Confederacy, but there was no unified government, and the states did what they wanted inside. By 1789, the leaders of the states, in order to solve the problem, wrote a common constitution and elected the first president, George Washington. He remains the only one in history to garner 100% of the vote, but otherwise, from that point on, the U.S. began gaining territory and didn't stop until the Civil War. A little later, this page will remain in history as Manifest Destiny. This is how historians describe the, constant itching in American butts and their desire to repopulate new territories by imposing their way of life. This preordained desire justified the Americans' violent campaigns against the Indians, the development of new states, and the expansion of their own borders. Allegedly, the USA should extend from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean and control everything. It worked out quite well. The Indians were pressed to the west and north, and the Spanish territories were picked up from the south. And in 1812, they ended up in the Second War of Independence. Not many people know about it, but England had a rematch for 3 years, getting slapped on the cheeks. And in 1815, with the next peace treaty, the USA finally marked the claim to existence as a full-fledged state. After all, a little earlier they had bought Louisiana from Napoleon. A little later they smashed Mexico by annexing Texas. And somewhere in between, they took Florida from the Spaniards. Also, the guys were building railroads, and the industry was developing at a breakneck pace, because again, migration from Europe was not going anywhere. Only now, not only daredevils were going to the United States, but also professionals who were tired of taxes and constant wars and metropolises in Europe. True, this was mostly about the North. The South continued to cultivate plantations with slaves, and for the most part didn't bother with technology, selling raw materials and food. That included the North. The system worked for a while, but by the 1860s it had finally failed, resulting in a civil war. We talked about it in one of the videos, and in fact the whole war can be described very simply. The North needed men, workers, and promoted the abolition of slavery, and the South was fine with everything. They didn't want to change anything and even tried to secede from the United States, but they lost the war, because the industry in the North was running them over with guns and was poaching black people, promising them freedom. So you know what happened next? The South fell, and a unified U.S. began large-scale industrialization. True, there is a fun fact that many do not know. That is where the roots of the confrontation between Republicans and Democrats, which we now follow in every election. The Democrats now present themselves as African-American fans, minority rights activists, and mostly socialists with a communist smell. But back then, the Democrats were the driving force behind the slave-holding South. And even after their defeat, they would periodically break into power by making atrocious laws against black people. For example, the Jim Crow laws, which began in 1890 with the segregation of blacks and whites, and the Republicans, in turn, preached equality and freedom for all. That was the key to the titanic leap that made the U.S. a real hegemon by the beginning of the 20th century. The period from 1877 to 1895, thanks to Mark Twain, is called the Gilded Age. It is difficult to disagree with this, because in those years, coal mining grew by 800%, corn by 250%, and railroads by 550%. And it was all about that very American freedom. Everyone was really equal, and the government tried to create minimal barriers to wealth for talented people, which many believe corrupted the money-mad people and led to the crisis and then to the so-called era of progressivism. When politicians popularized prohibition, people demanded anti-corruption and workers demanded fair conditions. In short, everything came true. Prohibition was passed, reforms were attempted, but all this contributed to the Great Depression, one of the greatest world crises in history. But before that, the U.S. managed to prove itself in wars outside the continent by fighting on the side of the Entente in World War I. The Americans made war with the Spaniards, and in 1898 finally ousted them by taking over Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And in general, until 1917, the U.S. adhered to a policy of isolation. But after the First World War, the boys remembered about that very predestination and began to take active part in the destiny of the planet. Actually, thanks to the enormous influence of Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations appeared, and the USA began to magically receive preferences at all possible levels. There is no magic here, only democracy. After all, the diplomats, grown in conditions of the cruelest competition and freedom of the USA, smashed to smithereens the cousins, matchmakers, and brothers of rulers of other powers, who got positions mainly by cronyism. though the Americans did not reach the League of Nations in the end, because Wilson suddenly became ill, and the League actually began to participate without the USA. But these troubles did not prevent the American banks from squeezing the defeated Germany under themselves, and the US, open to the planet, experienced growth again, becoming the world's financial center. The simplest way to describe the situation is a simple fact. By the end of the 1920s, Americans produced as much industrial output as the rest of the world combined. In 1929, the guys produced 5 million cars a year. That is why the Black Thursday that befell America was a shock for the whole world. There was a collapse at the stock exchange, and combined with deflation and natural disasters and depreciation of industrial assets, it plunged the country and the whole world into a severe crisis for 10 years. Only with the help of Franklin Roosevelt's reforms could we get out of it, even though many historians consider them contradictory and unnecessary. Well, you certainly know what happened afterwards. The USA helped the Allies under the program Lend-Lease and promoted overthrow of Germany again, and once again financially squeezed half of the planet, starting a confrontation with the other, the red half. At the same time, they sent people into space, lost presidents, and continued to fight between Democrats and Republicans. These are relatively recent events about which you probably know, and we will not dwell on them. We will only note that all the so-called magic of America is not really magic at all. It is only desire of people to be free together with excellent laws of initial epochs. And of course, the very same pragmatism. After all, while the colonial powers in Europe were determining whose king was cooler, in the United States, everything was transparent and modern. It is absolutely logical that industry, working not under the conditions of kings but under the conditions of the market, has eaten up everything else. And the origins of everything lie not in mysticism, but in the very history which we hope you have come to like. Well, that's it for now. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And also suggest your ideas for future releases in the comments. See you soon, folks.